welcome to another edition of Postgres Pulse. We are at our 10th episode, and we're certainly happy to have everyone join us this week. Just a quick refresher for anyone who has not been here before, and perhaps those who maybe come through a couple of times. The purpose of this is really to kind of answer any questions you might have related to Postgres. Could be related to a specific problem, could be related to a technology aspect, or just a general question around any of the curiosities that you have with Postgres or any of the flavors you may find out there today. A couple of quick reminders and guidelines. Please use the Q&A button to ask a question. Ensure that you stay muted while you're actually listening rather than talking. We'll go ahead and unmute you if you choose to go back and forth with us while we're talking through your question. And then finally, please, of course, above everything, be civil and abide by the Postgres Code of Conduct. We'll drop those into the chat now, and we'll go ahead and get started. With us today, we have, of course, myself, Josh Heyer. We've got Vibhor Kumar, Bruce Momjian, and a guest today in Jan Karaman. You guys are familiar most likely with Vibhor, Bruce, Josh, and myself over the last many episodes, but you may not be as familiar with Jan. So I wanted to take a minute, and Jan, if you want to take a moment to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background, what you do today.
Sure. Thank you for having me to begin with. And I'm happy to join this forum this afternoon or morning or evening. I head up the EDB pre-sales engineering team in EMEA. That means that as a sales engineer, I work with customers and partners to be successful with Postgres in all its shapes and forms. I've joined EDB 3.5 years ago now, coming from a broad background, but basically as a red guidance line that was always relational databases. Red says it already a little bit, the relational databases in the past were Oracle, as many people will have perhaps started on Oracle in databases. At some point I saw the light and I joined Enterprise DB. I joined the Postgres movement. I met Bruce, I met all of you fantastic guys and kind of saw the light, got hooked, and here I am.
3.5 years later, you're still hooked.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you for that. So, of course, Jan brings a different perspective than what we've had traditionally on the call, from a services architect perspective, from one of the founders of Postgres perspective, support perspective, developer advocacy, and now we've got Jan's background as well in this episode to help go through his perspective where it pertains to whether it be sales engineering or someone who's come from some of the commercial databases into Postgres, and what we're talking about today. And what we're talking about today is related to the blog that we had posted over the course of the last several days. Josh is going to drop that into the chat. And really it focuses around, when you're going into Postgres, do you go it alone or do you bring in a trusted advisor or a trusted vendor? Now, where you're coming from commercial backgrounds purely, you generally tend to rely on the framework that you have available to you with any of the traditional RDBMSs. What that affords you, obviously, is there's always someone to call when something goes bump in the night, and there's generally a very large scale of IP or private IP type frameworks around the product that you're working with. Going into Postgres, people often talk about the freedom, right? It's open source. It's really fantastic in that regard, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. But one of the things that it brings with it is the responsibility of ensuring that what you bring about, what you culminate as your environment, is actually something that you have to bear a lot of scrutiny on to ensure that it's ready for whatever you're going to throw at it from a production perspective. So in the blog, we talked about a specific problem that we saw a customer face a little over a year ago. And the customer came to us with a fairly vague problem. They were experiencing random performance issues. They had slow queries, but they couldn't really tie it to any time of day. They couldn't tie it to any specific period of time. It could be 5 minutes. It could be 5 hours. Now, the challenge that they ran into was they didn't actually change anything in their environment that would cause any reason for belief that something was a catalyst to this, at least not on the surface. So we did what we always do. We take a step back. And while we're taking a step back, I want to remind folks that if you guys have any questions around your situations you've run into, if this sounds a little familiar, please feel free to drop those into the chat, and we'll attack those as we go through. So we took a step back and we looked at the logs, and ultimately we saw nothing of significant merit. PostgreSQL conf looked healthy. The logs themselves didn't show anything that was out of sorts. And in the customer's SolarWinds implementation, it didn't look as though there was a broader problem in the environment. As we always tell everyone, look at everything in your environment, see if you're the only one that's actually suffering from a database perspective, or if it's a bigger problem. So we knew they were running on 9.4. And as we actually went to look to see what specific version, just to see if maybe there was a specific defect at play from one of the earlier versions of 9.4, we found that we actually couldn't run the Postgres-v command. We found that it was a pathing issue. We were able to find that they were on 9.4.10, I believe. So it wasn't the first build, but it certainly wasn't the last build of 9.4. But we noticed that there was a little bit of a hitch in where the pathing had failed, and we kind of put that on a shelf. So we looked at the environment. We saw that effectively everything was performing as it should be. There were a couple exceptions to that, though. So we saw that the memory consumption above all else on the host, only the database host, was actually at 100% during these events. The CPU itself was fine. Nothing else in the environment, network, CPU, overall load on the environment or on the fabric seemed fine. So we went
Memory
back.
pressure is a big deal, though, right? I mean,
Right.
So what goes through your head when you see something like that?
Exactly. So the only thing that we really had to hang our hats on, other than looking at each and every small problem that could be the challenge within the version they were on, was the pathing issue. So we asked them something we probably should have asked them at the onset. How did you get to where you are with Postgres? It was at that point that we found out that the DBA that had actually implemented it several years before that was no longer there, and there was no real consistent handover of duties or design or documentation. So they kind of just had this environment up and going. All they knew is that the DBA had compiled it themselves from source. They weren't relying on Yum. They weren't relying on the typical tarballs. And they also were managing their extensions individually. They were using PGXN. Some of you may be familiar with it. If not, it's one of the more prolific extension sources out there for Postgres, where people can apply or present extensions for availability. And they were managing it all on their own. So at that point, we saw a couple red flags. They didn't know the environment. They didn't have any sort of source of how the environment got to where it was. And they did things in a very different way from how most companies do it today, or most organizations attempt it today. So we asked, just, can we approach this in a very sane way? Can we do a dump and restore? We'll put this into a new, fresh install of Postgres and see what happens. They actually had the time where they were able to do that. So we did so. We ended up doing a dump of the existing database into the fresh install, and lo and behold, the performance issues that they were seeing were no longer there. Now, okay, it's kind of a deus ex machina, right? You look at this and say, okay, well, this is just a happy ending with no real root cause behind it. But we saw so many different things as far as little problems that could be at play with the version they were on, the fact that they compiled it on their own, there was no information behind that, the fact that they managed their extensions, and we found out they were making use of cross-tab behavior, really kind of led us down this path where there were so many different adventures we could choose. The easiest way to get them back to a good state was basically by going about an install and starting out fresh. So lo and behold, problem was solved. Kind of brings us to where we start the conversation we've got here. A little bit long-winded, but I wanted everyone to have the context. So we talked a bit right at the onset of, do you go it alone or do you go with a vendor? And a number of us kind of talked about this slightly just beforehand, but I'd be curious to hear some live feedback where you guys have seen either of those paths succeed or fail. Jan, as an example, do you know of any, or have you seen, what's your experience where people try to perhaps go it alone or don't necessarily understand what it means to take the freedom of open source?
So if I would relate that back to the practice of a previous life, kind of you would always go in a situation where you had this kind of organization behind you that would catch your bed, right? Because if you would go at it alone, meaning you would download the software, you would install it. So there is very hard options to compile it yourself. It's mostly just the installable. So you would basically stay safeguarded from being in such a situation. You could always kind of cast out that lifeline, and especially back in the day, the responses were fairly okay. So you could actually work with that. I think if that, and I wrote it down, and I think I mentioned it in the previous discussion as well. Postgres is free, you know, open source free, but it's not free as in you don't have to pay anything, but it's free as in freedom. So you do have, and that ties into the other kind of
It's only free if your time is worth nothing, right?
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to pay something. It's just, is it wise? Is it wise not to pay anything? That's the question.
It ties into the other cliche that says, you know, freedom comes with great responsibility. And that then brings me to something you told me, Bruce, about the company that was trying to do Postgres by themselves. If you want to have this freedom, if you want to take the responsibility, you have to do the investment up front, right? So for this customer to do what they did, they sure as hell needed to know what they were getting themselves into. And probably this project, and this is just me backcoloring a little bit. This project started small, and this DBA thought, well, cool, let me get this show on the road, right? And not overthinking it, or not even thinking it through very much, right? So you can do that in this old proprietary world, where you will always know that somebody's got your back, and you can kind of assume that this will happen in the Postgres world as well. But, you know, solving operational problems by people that develop a product and are focused on development doesn't necessarily mean that they will also jump in to clean up your failures.
Well, this is something that really jumped out at me from Jamie's story here is, you know, we talked a lot in the past year about the importance of monitoring, the importance of keeping tabs. What Jamie was digging into here, what the support team was flushing out, was that the critical information wasn't in the logs, it wasn't in their monitoring system, it was in the history of the organization. It was in the story about how it came to be in this way. And once they latched onto this, you know, you realize that, okay, you've built it from source. You've done your custom Postgres, which is great. It's awesome that you have the power to do that, but then you've never updated it. You've lost the ability to do, you know, minor version upgrades, which opens you up to a whole lot of potential issues that you wouldn't necessarily have to contend with if you were on, you know, the official release plan, right?
Yeah, that's really a key point, right? Because there were a bunch of things that did change in those particular versions, right? They ended up on, I think it was 9.4.20, but there was no granularity to say, okay, they were on 9.4.10. What happened when they went to 11, 12, et cetera, right? There was no progression. It was this stale model that they had for which they had no context as to why.
That
right?
part of the story was missing. You didn't know. And I'll drop a link in here. The documentation for Postgres, building from scratch is pretty comprehensive. It's not trivial, but if you want to do it, it's all there. You have that power. You have that freedom. The thing that clued you into this was that there were steps that had been missed in this. The installation was not perfectly complete, not in the sense that you would normally expect from one of the packaged installers.
Right.
I mean, they might have been, they might have installed from the packages initially, and then maybe they found a problem. Maybe they went to the community for help. The community developed a proof of concept patch
Right.
that they were going to put in the next major release. and the person switched to compiling from source, applied the patch, and installed it. I mean, there's no reason you can't do that, but you better know that that's what you're running,
Right.
right? And understand enough to know that that patch is behaving well in your environment.
And also set up a plan for how you're going to monitor that going forward. And in
Right,
terms of
because the
minor
patch
version
would be in
upgrades,
9.5, right? So then you should go to
yeah,
9.5. So you're not running a non-standard patch. It's possible sometimes when we work on a proof of concept patch, it fixes the problem. It goes into the code, but then during beta testing of the next major, we realized that although that patch fixed problem X, it made it added a new problem that we now have to adjust the patch. But that person may not be following what happened to that patch and how it caused a different problem.
Right.
It had to be fixed, and they're still running, whatever they had. So that's a problem.
and that's your responsibility to deal with, as Jan was saying here. You get that power, you get that ability that you don't really have to this extent in most other systems, but you have the responsibility to follow up on it as well. And if you don't, nobody's going to catch you unless you do what this client did and hire somebody to help you with it.
And
Right.
different countries have different philosophies. I know certain countries are much more willing to patch their get a patch from the internet and just apply it and then run with it. But there's some reasons why you might not want to do that. But certainly, if you don't know if you've done that or not, right, then that could be an issue.
Right.
Yeah, and it could be possible that if there is a company who's using the software from the vendor, right? What they do, they bundle up the Postgres custom installation with the whole package. So if you're using that custom installation of the Postgres, right, then you may see a little different kind of a configuration, or maybe some flags here and there is not available properly. But again, in that case, so the people who are just providing the software, they take the responsibility of supporting the Postgres in the application both, or maybe they are making a, they build some kind of agreement with the other vendors or Postgres supporters, right, who can support them, and indirectly they can support Postgres to their customers.
And then they also have PGXN extensions in there
Mhm.
too. We don't know if they kept up with those
Correct.
versions,
Yeah.
or if the version they installed matched the version that the Postgres version matched the the PGXN version, whatever, that they were known to work well. So it's pretty complicated piece of software. You're
Correct.
right. You now have the flexibility of compiling your own and compiling your own, adding your own patches and adding your own extensions. But again, with that freedom becomes a lot of responsibility, because now
Mhm.
you're not running a standard build. You're not necessarily keeping it current, and you're not absolutely sure how it's going to behave. And when you have a problem, sometimes it doesn't show up in the logs, right? It's because it's not something we're used to monitoring, because it's a non-standard setup.
It's
Yeah.
kind of a gliding slope, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think in each and every phase of the open source software use, right? You would like to tie up with the one vendor who is supporting the Postgres properly. It's like, for example, if you're evaluating open source software, you would like to gain the knowledge. You would like to know how you would like to properly use the open source software. And the vendor who's supporting the software, they can give you best practices, guidelines, the capabilities it has. How would you like to use specific feature in the application? So that level of support, you will get it from a development perspective, or maybe you're building a mission critical application. So if you're building a mission critical application, you would like to evaluate the software from all aspects, from security aspects, from the high availability aspects, and definitely a vendor who's working with the community to support the software would be able to help you. And in case you found a specific bug because of the issues with the open source software on your platform, maybe because of the hardware or the kind of operating system you're using it, and the vendor who's working with the community would be able to provide you patch to fix those issues, and would be able to help you to recover your data in case something wrong happened in the production. So from all those aspects, I believe having a support for the open source software is really, really important when you are going to run mission critical application, or if the data is very, very important for your business.
Right,
Right.
right.
It's basically what Bruce also said, right? Postgres is a pretty complex piece of software. And what we see in the market also is the kind of people now adopting Postgres more and quicker for more complicated use cases. So highly critical, mission critical applications that need to be highly available. And then getting your head around Postgres, getting your head around architectures, can be pretty daunting task, right? So if the vendor can then help speed up that process by you kind of avoid a lot of the early pitfalls that you might have in kind of getting these kind of systems set up.
Yeah, and that's why it's remind me of code, right? Instead of learning from your mistake, why not learn from the mistakes of the others? Or maybe hire an expert, right, who has a good amount of experience and learn over the period about the software, and take that knowledge or information and be more productive with the open
Right.
source software.
Yeah, because it enables you to actually make the right decision in a faster way too, right? Because you may ultimately come to the same conclusion that a trusted vendor would, but it may take you a significantly longer period of time to come to that conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Or you may reach a point where you think you have the answer, and then you make judgments based off of that, with the untold consequences. Sorry,
Jamie, how did you handle the PGXN part? Because does enterprise DB support? See, the problem is there's so much available now, right?
Yep.
This is I was at the Southeast Linux Fest conference yesterday, the online version, and there was a great talk about somebody who's saying there are so many frameworks out there. How do you find out which one to use, which one's supported, which one's secure, which one's going to be around, which one's not bloated? You know, so for PGXN, there's so much stuff out there, and I assume that most vendors don't offer support for most of that stuff.
Right. So from our perspective, the way we handle it in this one case, the extension that they were using was a supported extension. It was table func, but it was that they had gotten it from PGXN and they had never bothered to update it. That was one of the problems that we were seeing. So there's no prejudice against people using PGXN, as long as whatever it is that they're using, whatever extension they're using, is a exact equivalent for what would be in the core distributions. And we publish, just from our vendor perspective, we publish a list of all the extensions that we do support out on the website. But we're continually evaluating those, based off of whatever demand ultimately comes, either because of what's in the core distribution or because of things that may be getting a lot of traction, let's say in PGXN or these days GitHub, wherever it might be, right? In a broader sense, that kind of covers that piece as well, right? It's make sure that it is equivalent to what we know is good and supported, rather than just kind of going by the seat of one's pants. Jan, to your point, people are using it at such a greater scale at this point that it's not just the technical complexity or the currency burden that it places on people, right? It's also the compliance piece, right? So if you're in FinSec or if you're in certain, ISO-driven organizations, whatever it might be, you may require some fulsome body there to support any of the code that you're running in production.
Absolutely.
Now, even if that's the case, some people elect to build their own and within that build their own team that may ultimately contribute to the community. And I certainly don't beget folks that do that. It brings about a lot of opportunity for innovation and democracy within Postgres. But it can also lead to a lot of pratfalls, right? Famously, there was that post a few years ago where Uber had gone from Postgres to MySQL, and some of the reasons for doing so, a number of folks stepped back from the community and said, well, you could have gone about this a different way, right? There were some significant assumptions that were made there that led to a change that they may not have actually had to go through. There are others that have done so very successfully, and others that, with less visibility or less publicity, may have had similar challenges. But those are the pieces that you really have to understand that you're taking on as your responsibility when you go into this space and you choose to do it either on your own or with a vendor.
I mean, ultimately, that is the big value of having a community-driven system like this, right? Is you do have so many people out there with knowledge that you don't. If you don't avail yourself of that,
Yeah,
then you're not really getting the full advantage
Right.
of
And you
Postgres.
could go to those communities, right? And we see that with people that maybe it's not mission critical, or maybe they're providing mission critical for their implementation, and they're asking people they consider to be peers or their technical superiors, right? They're asking the community, "Hey, I'm seeing this. What are your thoughts?" Right? And that's a solution for some, but if you don't have
You don't
that
have an SLA when you do that.
right, you're just going out
People
there
are
to ask good questions.
extremely generous. I've seen people put, weeks into tracking down a problem for somebody on the mailing list,
Right,
but you know they're doing it in their spare time.
right,
It,
right,
it, 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 it kind of also depends, I think, on the stance of the organization you work for, right? So some organizations are more prone to kind of focus on the value add that they're strongest in, and they would then tend to go with a supported version of a product, where a lot obviously of the other companies say, it's cool, I want to contribute, I really want to be part of this. And we obviously know the players in the market that say, we're going to be part of the community, Zalando entity data and the players, and not to can do short to anybody, but right, that's a different way of working with the product, different way of working with the market.
right. Absolutely. So,
yeah.
Vibor, from your experience, where have you seen similar scenarios, or perhaps dissimilar, but along the same vein, where that burden that comes with that freedom, or that responsibility that comes with that freedom, doesn't necessarily become apparent until it's a problem, or until it's a challenge?
Yeah, I saw with multiple people, who were using the open source version of software, and they reach out to us when they were facing the troubles and the problem. It wasn't really the performance issues. Sometimes it was a corruption to the database. And even if it is a performance issues, they were not able to supply proper information to us, right? So that we could debug the problem or troubleshoot the problem and help them to fix the issue in the environment. That was mainly because they compiled the software themselves and they used with the application the production system, and they were pretty much happy because that's a benefit of, so that's a disadvantage of using a PostgreSQL. It will not give you problem. It will always be up and running in any platform where you're running it, right? But if you are doing something weird, or if you haven't compiled it correctly, then yes, you will see some problems. And this is what happened. And the version which I can tell you, it was PostgreSQL 8.2. They were using it, and they never bothered to apply patches from the community because that time 8.2 was supported. And uh, and mainly because they haven't applied those patches, they saw so many issues, and they were not able to figure out how would they move forward, right? First of all, they were running in the production. Planning for the upgrade or applying the patches was critical because they wanted to make the system up and running all the time, and
Yep.
they haven't planned out properly exactly how would they apply those new patches. And that time streaming application was not in the picture, but we were supporting customers using the Stoneage application. We were saying that use Stoneage application to maintain the high availability, or maybe a operating system level of cluster to maintain the high availability, so that you can apply the patches if it is provided to you. Second, for a long period we were not able to find out the problem because there were not a lot of information available.
Right.
The logging parameters which was needed to track all those issues in the log file to see or get the visibility exactly what's going on in the PostgreSQL were not there at all. So and again, when we resolved those problems, they understood the advantage of having a support from a company who's really working with the community and giving you the guidance on how to use open source product was a key for them. And that's why they again engage with us, and they ask a lot of questions around the best practices. How should they deploy? What are the important parameters they should enable so that in future, if
Sure.
this kind of issue comes, we will have visibility exactly what's going on in the system.
Right.
right? And defining complete approaches or methodology which they can follow to apply the bug fixes or any new capabilities coming in the community. They should be able to leverage that. So yeah, that was a key indicator. I mean, for them to see the benefit out of the enterprise DB, and they reach out to us and we help them in that direction. And that's what I always recommend. When you are going to use a software in the community or open
Yep.
source software in your application or in the production environment, you should
Bring it
think
right.
exactly how you're going to use it, right? And how you would like to reach out to the expert and take advantage of the expert
Right.
so they can fast track the whole development, plus make sure that everything is stable and working correctly.
Right.
And when some issue comes, somebody is there to support you, right?
Right. Right.
And
Because
so
you can either build your own house or
yeah,
you can actually have it built for you by the experts. Right.
correct.
That's kind of
And
the message that it all comes down to, I think.
yeah,
You can either take on the burden yourself and have a creative birth entirely of your own imagination, or you can bring in others so you can focus on wherever else you may need to prioritize your innovation and your
correct,
functions.
correct.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
great. All right, thank you.
yeah,
All right, so as you guys can see, certainly the choice are myriad when it comes to how you can go about implementing this. What it comes down to is really deciding, do you want to take on the ownership and the responsibility that comes with the freedom of open source of your own creation or your own compilation, or do you want to have a trusted resource or a trusted vendor that allows you to have that in play, not just initially, but also into perpetuity, whether it be upgrades or expansion or architectural changes. All right, great. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for your time today. Jan, in particular, as our guest this week. Thank you for making the time. Your perspective was definitely valuable to the conversation. We enjoy having your voice here. Just a quick cleanup for folks. You can certainly follow along with us on enterprisedb.com/postgres-pulse. We have blogs that are published every other week, and you can ask questions of us, whether it be on LinkedIn or Twitter or at postgrespulse@enterprisedb.com. Hashtag is postgrespulse. And we'll be here again in 2 weeks' time talking through the next topic. So feel free to check us out, and we appreciate everyone's time and focus here today, and don't be shy. Thanks, everyone.
thank
Take
you.
care.
So long.
Bye-bye.